So we are our brains is a provocative statement. It is at once a structuring of the self and of the social. It is an epistemological conclusion as well. How we know ourselves and each other is through our knowledge of and about our brains. And how we know about the shape, size, textures, synapses, chemistry, in short, all the inner workings of the brain, come to us primarily by way of the scientific method, its practitioners and spokespeople. Joe Dumit has argued that new information and facts about brains that arrive via media, social movements, published findings, and clinical interactions precipitate a continual fashioning and refashioning of what he terms an objective self. If we were to couch our key statement in Dumit's terms, then we might arrive closer to, we are our brains, but, and, if, when, under some conditions. The probability distributions that we equate with the outcome of experimental systems may be able to account for such conjecture, but for journalists, reporting on science most definitively is not able to deal with such wishy-washy abstractions. Or so it might have been said before the avalanche that began with the internet. Let me start with the science part. Most thinking about how to get science across to the public is still based formally or informally on the public understanding of science models that assume several elements: an authoritative stance for science, a set of stable facts that can be communicated, the need for a democratic public to know, and a measurable lack of scientific literacy among the general public. Science studies scholars like Brian Wynn and others have, for a couple decades now, critiqued these kinds of models for their lack of recognition of the heterogeneity of science and of diverse publics. These models ignore how the social and scientific are embedded in one another and the wider commitments that prioritize individual and group involvement with and a desire to know about issues. Not only that, Sheila Jasnoff has particularly pointed out that how, when, and on whose terms scientific evidence is accepted is a distinctly cultural process, one that she terms civic epistemology. This process is deeply embedded in institutions, and it has ramifications for what evidence counts and why, and how it gets reported on, interpreted, and framed. But here's the second part, the media part. Technologies, institutions, and the profession and processes otherwise known as the media are in the midst of immense upheaval. In 2012, all but online media and cable TV saw a continued decline in audiences. These kinds of declines and changes have been happening year over year for well over a decade now. Yet it's not that the internet is taking over. It's much more diffuse and complicated than that. Fragmentation, meaning the public's access to a vast range and assortment of sources, is the order of the day. Leading media scholars now talk in terms of an ecosystem, as a way to account for how individuals plug and replug the bits and pieces of information they gather from many sources. And in such an ecosystem, the thirst for news and discussion about the world is only increasing. Blogs, microblogs, otherwise known as Twitter, and other forms of online social commentary and circulation continue to grow unabated. What's becoming increasingly apparent is that this transformation has meant that journalists, who were traditionally seen as informers, agenda setters, and watchdogs, have now become forum providers, a kind of chief discussant, if you will, and extant verifier. This is still a very new role for journalists and news providers to navigate or even understand. Climate change as an issue and object of concern has been both notorious and exemplary of this transformation. At a conference held here last year, a science journalist described what it's like to report on climate change in the crowdsourced, transparent, participatory reality that most journalists now face this way. He said, reporting on climate change was like parking your car under a bunch of starlings. Funny, right? But poignant too. Being shat upon in any context is really unpleasant, but particularly so if you are presenting scientific consensus and reliable evidence. Popular Science magazine recently took the extraordinary step of closing off this starling-laden avenue when they shut down their comment section, citing, A politically motivated, decades-long war on expertise has eroded the popular consensus on a wide variety of scientifically validated topics, unquote. And they're not alone. This isn't a science-only or climate change problem. Paul Krugman did something similar after a 9/11 article that he published, and a Manitoba newspaper did the same thing after the Idle No More protests here in Canada last spring. But what does this mean when news reports indicate that 60% of the American public now go online when they have a question about science, and they are exposed to a range of opinions, facts, and commentaries? The instinct for many in this Starling-like world has been to assert the role of experts, valorize peer-reviewed evidence and consensus, and to downplay the high engagement that occurs in the swirling vortex of public discourse. But if we are to take seriously the notion that the social and scientific are embedded in one another, or the notion of civic epistemologies where publics have distinctly cultural and national ways of coming to accept evidence, then a radically open, networked, and often mediated public discourse is perhaps not a problem to be expunged or ignored. In my research on climate change, I have looked not just at the production of doubt, as many great researchers have done, but at the production of care, of how climate change has come to matter for journalists, scientists, and a diverse group of social movements. They are, regardless of their wider assumptions and beliefs and/or professional standing, caught in a double bind. That of maintaining fidelity to scientific findings and the need to make climate change much more than a scientific fact, to invest it with meaning, ethics, and morality in order to rationalize and define what the right thing is to do collectively and individually regarding climate change. So let me pose a similar question here. How do brains come to matter? In answering this question, do we then arrive at a series of other contradictory, complementary claims and counterclaims? And more importantly, given the primary assertion on the table, how do we make room for other narrations of the essentialist and non-essentialist variety in relation to making sense of who and what we are? What role is there for the collective, for wider commitments, allegiances, and beliefs? And when do such differences, either of the epistemological or end goal variety, matter? Who can speak for and about the brain, if indeed we are our brains, caveated or not?